Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. The cold steel of the command room thrummed under Captain Elias Mercer's boots as he stepped inside. His expression locked in the stoic neutrality expected of an officer in the Terran Expeditionary Force. Around him, the air smelled of disinfectant, alien incense, and a faint metallic tang that always clung to these conquered worlds. Before him, a delegation of Varan dignitaries waited, their tall, avian-like bodies draped in ceremonial silks. Their long fingers twitched in what their translators called a gesture of goodwill. Behind them, human officers stood at attention, some already admiring the gifts their hosts had provided. Elias had seen this before. Every time a new world was brought under Terran control, its ruling class sought favor with the conquerors. They offered tributes of wealth, technology, or, in the case of the Varan elites, living gifts. A flick of motion caught his eye. A figure was brought forward, a woman unmistakably alien, yet striking in a way that made his gut twist. She was smaller than the Varan, her form delicate and sinuous, with smooth, pearl-like skin that shimmered under the artificial lights. Dark eyes, too large for a human, regarded him warily from beneath a cascade of silken black hair. She wore little more than fine golden wrappings that accentuated her lithe form, and around her neck was a thin, ornate collar that marked her as property. The Varan noble stepped forward, spreading his clawed hands in a welcoming gesture. "Captain Mercer," the translator droned in its dull monotone. "In recognition of your people's strength and mercy, we offer you this rare treasure. She is of the Sari, a most loyal and affectionate breed. A gift of companionship, amusement, and pleasure." The words turned Elias' stomach. He had fought in wars, seen the worst of humanity and the universe, but this felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. Beside him, Major Anton Rourke chuckled as he clapped a hand on Elias' shoulder. "Hell of a gift, Captain. Better than any medal, eh?" Elias barely kept his face impassive. He had no intention of accepting a sentient being as property, but outright refusal could be seen as an insult, a delicate situation on a newly occupied planet. He exhaled slowly and nodded once. "I accept your generosity," he said carefully. The Varan noble's beak-like mouth stretched in what passed for a smile. Seshka, as the noble called her, lowered her gaze, her expression unreadable. Elias turned away, the weight of his decision settling over him. He hadn't just accepted a gift, he had accepted a responsibility. And something told him that Seshka was far more than what she appeared to be. Elias sat at the edge of his bunk, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the woman seated across from him. Seshka. She hadn't moved much since entering his quarters. She knelt on the floor, hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully neutral. The golden wrappings she wore shimmered in the dim light, emphasizing the unnatural stillness of her form. Even now, she barely met his gaze. Elias ran a hand through his short, military-cut hair. This was absurd. The other officers had already taken their gifts with enthusiasm. He'd overheard their crude remarks in the mess hall. How their Varan hosts bred the perfect pets. How obedient they were. How their kind never spoke unless spoken to. The whole thing made his skin crawl. He cleared his throat. "You don't have to sit on the floor." No response. Elias frowned. "You can sit on the chair if you want." Seshka remained still, her head slightly bowed. Right. He wasn't stupid. She was playing the role expected of her, the one drilled into her since her people had been conquered. A pet didn't speak unless commanded. Pet didn't disobey. With a sigh, he leaned back. "All right, let's get something straight. I don't know what your people have been told about humans, but I'm not interested in owning anyone." That earned a flicker of movement. Her head tilted ever so slightly. A reaction. Encouraged, Elias continued. "I don't know what kind of life you had before, but you're not going to be my slave." He gestured at the room. "You can walk around. Do whatever you want." Seshka finally lifted her gaze, her dark eyes searching his face for something. Distrust, perhaps, or disbelief. Slowly, she shifted her weight, unfolding herself from her kneeling position. Still cautious, but now standing, She studied him with quiet intensity. Elias exhaled, relieved to see some sign of independent thought. "Do you understand me?" Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak, but instead, she hesitated. Then finally she nodded. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next few days were strange. Seshka moved through his quarters like a ghost, never making a sound, never getting in the way. But she was observant, always watching, always listening. Elias had seen her peering at the holographic reports on his desk when she thought he wasn't looking. She took particular interest in the files detailing the Terran occupation of Varan 5. When he'd offered her actual clothes, spare military fatigues instead of those ridiculous silk wrappings, she had hesitated before accepting them, as if testing whether this was some sort of trick. The more time he spent around her, the harder it was to ignore the truth. She was no pet, no mindless, obedient creature. She was intelligent, and she was hiding it. One evening, Elias returned from a briefing to find Seshka standing near the window, staring out at the alien city below. The skyline of Varan 5 was a stark contrast of old and new. Sleek Terran military outposts cast their shadow over crumbling temples and ancient spires of Sari craftsmanship. The Varan elites had ruled this world for centuries. The Sari? They had once been its scholars, its artists, its builders. Now they were nothing but property. Elias set his helmet down and crossed his arms. "I know you understand me." Seshka flinched. "I've seen how you watch everything," he continued. "You're not just some docile pet. You're thinking, analyzing." He stepped closer, voice softer now. "You don't have to pretend with me." For a long moment, she was silent. Then, barely above a whisper, she spoke. "I know." Elias straightened. It was the first time he had heard her voice, soft, melodic, with an accent unlike any other species he had encountered. He held her gaze. "Then why the act?" Seshka exhaled slowly, eyes dark with something unreadable. "Because if they know what I really am," she trailed off, fingers grazing the collar at her throat. "They will kill me." Elias clenched his jaw. He had suspected as much, but hearing it aloud made his stomach tighten. "How many others are like you?" he asked. A bitter smile touched her lips. "More than you can imagine." Elias felt a sinking weight settle in his chest. How many humans had accepted the lie that the Sari were mere pets? How many had looked at them and seen only property, not people? And how complicit had he been in all of this? Seshka turned back to the window. "We used to be a great people," she murmured. "Before the Varan came. Before they told the galaxy we were less." Elias had no words. For the first time, he looked beyond the war, beyond the politics, beyond the orders he had followed without question. He saw the truth, and he knew he could no longer ignore it. Elias lay awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his mind a tangled mess. Seshka's words haunted him. "Because if they know what I really am, they will kill me." He had always prided himself on being a soldier who followed orders but kept his conscience intact. Yet how many times had he looked the other way? How many planets had he helped liberate, only for their people to end up like the Sari, enslaved under a different master? His gut told him that if the Varan elites knew Seshka had spoken, they wouldn't just kill her. They'd make an example of her. Elias exhaled sharply, pushing himself up. He turned toward the small corner where Seshka now slept. On the cot he had insisted she take instead of the floor. She wasn't asleep. She lay still, facing away from him, but her breathing was too controlled. "Seshka," he said quietly. She didn't move. "You can stop pretending. I know you're awake." A few heartbeats passed before she finally shifted, rolling onto her back. Her dark eyes met his, unreadable in the dim glow of the room's overhead panel. Elias sat up fully. "Tell me the truth. How many of your people are still free?" Seshka hesitated. "Why?" "Because," he said, rubbing his face, "I think I just realized I've been on the wrong side of this war." A long silence stretched between them. Then, she propped herself up on her elbows. "There's a resistance," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "Not many of us. We're scattered. Always moving, always hiding." She swallowed. Most humans, they don't care to know. You're the first who's ever asked. That stung more than it should have. Elias swung his legs off the bunk, resting his elbows on his knees. How do they communicate? How do they find each other? Seshka studied him carefully. You really want to know? He met her gaze. I do. She sat up fully now. We have a network. A hidden one buried under the systems the Varen control. Your people don't see it because they don't know what to look for. A network? Elias frowned. Like an underground transmission? Seshka hesitated, then shook her head. More like a message board. That caught him off guard. A message board? She gave a small, humorless smile. Yes, buried inside the systems your military uses. It looks like nonsense to anyone who doesn't understand. But to us, it's everything. We call it the gathering place. Our way of sharing information, warnings, locations of safe houses. Elias let out a breath. And you've been checking it, he realized. That's why you kept looking at my reports when you thought I wasn't paying attention. Seshka nodded. I had to know if any of my people were still alive. Her fingers curled in the fabric of the military-issued shirt he had given her. I thought I was alone. Elias leaned forward. You're not, he said firmly. For the first time, Seshka looked at him as if she actually believed him. The next evening, Elias made a choice that could get him executed. He let Seshka use his terminal. They were careful. The Terran military had surveillance in all official systems, but Elias had access to encrypted channels meant for high-ranking officers. With a few clever reroutes, he masked their activity. Seshka's fingers danced across the console with practiced ease, faster than he expected. Lines of alien script scrolled across the screen, shifting into something that resembled a chaotic jumble of symbols and numbers. But then, the screen flickered. A single message appeared, written in an odd blend of sorry and human shorthand. Shadowfeather, still fighting. Lost 3 today. Need extraction. New safe house in the red sector. Code 7721. Seshka inhaled sharply, gripping the table. You recognize them? Elias asked. She nodded, blinking quickly. Shadowfeather was a historian. He helped create this network before the Varen started wiping us out. She scrolled further, reading through the fragmented messages. They're trapped. The military must have found one of their hideouts. Elias cursed under his breath. If his own people got their hands on them, they'd be as good as dead. We have to get them out, Seshka whispered. Elias hesitated. This was the moment, the point of no return. If he did this, if he helped the Sari escape, he'd be a traitor. But if he didn't, his fingers curled into fists. Seshka turned to him, her eyes pleading. You don't have to do this, she said. But there was a crack in her voice, a desperate hope she couldn't hide. He met her gaze. Yes, I do. And just like that, he made his decision. Elias moved carefully through the barracks, his heart pounding. It was well past curfew, which meant most soldiers were either asleep or drunk. He kept his head down, his uniform and rank giving him enough authority to avoid questions. He made his way toward the transport bay, where a series of unregistered hoverbikes were stored. If he was caught, the penalty would be severe. But he wasn't going alone. Seshka had insisted on coming. I know the city better than you, she had argued. And you need someone who speaks the right codes. She wasn't wrong. And if they had any chance of reaching the resistance fighters before the military did, speed was everything. Elias tapped his wrist communicator, disabling the GPS tracker. His official record would show him still in his quarters. A trick he'd learned from years of running unsanctioned missions. Seshka stood close, her expression unreadable. But her hands trembled slightly. Whether from fear or anticipation, he couldn't tell. This is insane, Elias muttered as he swung a leg over the hoverbike. Seshka climbed on behind him, gripping his waist to steady herself. So is pretending we don't exist, she said. Elias revved the engine. The doors slid open, revealing the neon-drenched city below. No turning back now. With a deep breath, he gunned the accelerator, and they shot into the night. The neon lights of Varen, 5 streaked past as Elias weaved the hoverbike through the towering cityscape. His jaw clenched. Seshka held on tightly behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her body tense. The military wouldn't notice they were missing yet, but they didn't have long before someone realized his terminal had been accessed for unauthorized communication. Every second counted. "You're sure about the safe house?" Elias shouted over the wind. Seshka leaned closer, her voice just above a whisper in his ear. "Yes. The red sector is where the Sari used to live before the occupation. It's mostly abandoned now, but there are tunnels beneath the city. If the others are still alive, they'll be hiding there." Elias swore under his breath. The red sector was also one of the most heavily monitored areas. It was where the military had herded most of the pet-class aliens, keeping them under close watch to prevent resistance cells from forming. Getting in would be difficult. Getting out, even harder. The streets below pulsed with life. Human patrols marching in formation, alien workers trudging through checkpoints, towering Varan elites watching from their crystalline spires. The entire planet was a pressure cooker, and tonight Elias had just decided to light the fuse. Seshka tapped his shoulder. "There's a maintenance tunnel ahead. Take that route. It will keep us off the scanners." Elias veered sharply, guiding the bike into a dark, narrow passage between 2 towering buildings. The walls closed in around them, the only illumination coming from the faint blue glow of Varan streetlights. As soon as they entered the tunnel, Seshka activated a small device hidden within her sleeve. Elias felt his HUD glitch for a brief second before stabilizing. "What did you do?" he asked. "Signal scrambler," she said, tucking it away. "It'll buy us some time before the patrols pick us up on their radar." Elias let out a dry chuckle. "You're full of surprises. You have no idea." The tunnel sloped downward, leading them beneath the city streets. The smooth steel walls soon gave way to rough, ancient stone, remnants of the old Sari civilization buried beneath centuries of conquest. Elias slowed the bike as the tunnel opened into a cavernous underground space. Old market stalls lay in ruins, shattered glass and debris scattered across the ground. This place had once been alive. Now it was a graveyard. Seshka dismounted first, scanning the area. "They should be here." A noise echoed from the shadows. Elias reached for his sidearm, his training kicking in. He stepped forward cautiously, keeping his body between Seshka and the unknown threat. A pair of glowing eyes flickered in the darkness. Then, a voice. "Seshka." She inhaled sharply. "Shadow Feather?" A thin figure stepped into the light, his dark, iridescent skin marred by fresh wounds. He wore ragged clothes, his frame gaunt from hunger. Behind him, 2 others emerged. Both sorry, both equally worn but defiant. Seshka rushed forward, gripping the man's hands. "You're alive." "Barely," he said, his voice hoarse. His gaze flickered to Elias, wary. "And who's this?" Elias lowered his weapon. "The guy getting you out of here." Shadowfeather studied him before nodding slightly. "If Seshka trusts you, I'll trust you." One of the others, a younger woman, stepped forward, clutching her arm where a deep cut bled freely. "We need to move," she whispered. "The patrols are sweeping the area. They know we're here." Elias cursed. "Then we don't have much time." "How many exits?" "Only one," Shadowfeather said. "But they'll be watching it." Elias' mind raced. "There's another way." Seshka looked at him. "What are you thinking?" He gestured toward the cavern ceiling. "The military doesn't know this place as well as you do, right? If we can find a maintenance shaft, I can override the security and get us into an access tunnel. From there, we can hijack a transport and slip through the checkpoints." Shadowfeather hesitated. "Risky, but possible," Seshka pressed. "It's better than staying here." Elias moved quickly, searching the walls for any signs of an old access route. Then there, a rusted hatch, half hidden behind debris. He pried it open, revealing a ladder leading upward. "This leads into the industrial sector," he said. "We climb fast, get to the surface, steal a transport, and we're gone before they know what happened." The others exchanged glances before Shadowfeather nodded. "Let's move." One by one they ascended. Elias went last, making sure Seshka and the others got through safely. When he finally emerged from the tunnel, he found himself in a dimly lit warehouse, the sound of distant machinery humming around them. The streets beyond were lined with heavy cargo transports. Perfect. Elias pulled Seshka aside. Stay close to me. She nodded, her hand gripping his sleeve for a fraction of a second before letting go. Elias crept forward, scanning the area. A pair of Terran guards stood near a transport, engaged in conversation. Distraction? Shadowfeather whispered. Elias smirked. I've got it. Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed a loose cargo container and heaved it toward a nearby stack of supplies. The loud crash echoed through the warehouse. The guards spun, weapons raised. What was that? One of them muttered. Probably a rat, the other grumbled, moving to investigate. That was their chance. Elias motioned for the others to move. One by one, they slipped into the back of an unlocked transport. He climbed in last, sealing the doors behind him just as the guards returned, none the wiser. The transport rumbled to life, its automated system taking it toward the outer city. Elias took a deep breath, his heart still pounding. Seshka looked at him, her dark eyes full of something unreadable. He had done it. They had escaped for now. But the hardest part was still ahead. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting back. The transport rumbled through the lower sectors of Varan 5, its sleek, unmarked exterior blending with the city's industrial veins. Elias sat on edge, his senses heightened, every passing moment filled with the tension of knowing they weren't safe yet. Seshka sat across from him, her face a study in quiet determination, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, a deep, unspoken fear. Shadowfeather, flanked by the others, remained tense, eyes darting between the streets outside the transport windows, scanning for signs of pursuit. We're almost there, Elias said quietly, his eyes flicking to the navigation panel. The transport was taking them out of the city, into the outskirts, where the last remnants of Sari resistance were rumored to be hidden. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He tapped the comms on his wrist. Keep an eye on the rear, he muttered. We've probably been flagged by now. Seshka's hand moved toward the device at her belt, her fingers brushing it instinctively. I can block the trackers for a few more minutes, but we'll need to make a detour. The military is watching all direct routes out of the city. Elias clenched his jaw. What other route? There's a small pass through the mountains, she said, her voice low. It's dangerous, but it's our only shot at avoiding detection. Elias glanced out the window. The landscape was beginning to change, the skyline of the city falling away as the barren, rocky terrain took over. He could see the jagged peaks of the Varan mountain range in the distance. The way out wasn't going to be easy, but if it kept them alive, they had no choice. Do it, he said. Seshka's fingers flew over the device on her belt, and the transport's internal systems flickered before stabilizing. The sudden change in course jolted them all, and Shadowfeather's eyes flicked to Seshka with a sharp look. Are you sure this is the best way? Yes, she said. If we go the direct route, we'll be spotted before we can even reach the border. The mountains are harder to track. The tension in the air thickened as the transport veered off course, heading straight for the jagged terrain. Elias felt every bump in the road, every creak of the transport's frame as it pushed forward. They were leaving the city far behind now, venturing into unknown territory. As the vehicle climbed higher, the wind began to pick up, howling through the cracks in the hull. The landscape below them stretched out in a bleak expanse, rocky plains and deep canyons that seemed to go on forever. Elias had no love for the barren landscapes of war, but there was something oddly freeing about being so far from the Varan-controlled city. Still, the threat of discovery loomed large. The Varan forces were nothing if not relentless. Suddenly, the transport jerked to a halt. Elias felt his stomach lurch. What the hell? He muttered, rising from his seat. Seshka was already tapping at her comms device, her face contorted with concentration. We've been hit. Their trackers have found us. A series of warning lights blinked to life on the dashboard, and Elias could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He didn't need to ask who was behind this. The Varan were closing in. Shadowfeather, what's our plan? Elias barked. The resistance leader didn't hesitate. We fight, he said, his voice firm. This is it. We either make it through this or we die here. Seshka reached for a concealed blaster at her side. I'll cover the rear, she said, her expression cold. We'll have to hold them off long enough to get to the cliffs. Elias grabbed his own weapon. We don't stand a chance in open combat. We need to get to cover first, then figure it out. Agreed, Shadowfeather said. Follow me. Keep low. And don't stop running until we reach the caves. Elias nodded, his heart pounding as the transport doors slid open with a hiss. The cold mountain air slapped his face as he moved into the open, the sound of enemy craft approaching growing louder by the second. A shuttle, low and fast, screamed overhead, its searchlights scanning the rocky plains for any sign of movement. Elias signaled the others to crouch down, and they took cover behind the jagged rocks as the shuttle circled, scanning for heat signatures. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the shuttle dropped to the ground, and the soldiers began to spill out. Varen soldiers. Elite. Elias' pulse quickened. There were too many of them. No way they could take them all down. But then, something in the distance caught his attention. A second shuttle, much larger, roared through the sky. It was a standard Terran transport. He cursed under his breath. Reinforcements, he muttered. We've got to move. Now! Seshka was already running, leading the group along a narrow pass between the cliffs. Elias followed close behind, every footstep echoing in the thin, sharp air. Behind them, the sound of gunfire began to ring out, followed by shouts and explosions as the Varen forces engaged. For a brief, fleeting moment, Elias felt the weight of his decision. They were fighting for their lives, for something bigger than him. And in that moment, he knew he could never go back. The narrow pass opened up into a cavern, the dark stone walls stretching high above them. Elias saw the telltale signs of resistance activity. Makeshift barricades, old caches of supplies hidden in the corners. This way, Seshka said, gesturing to a large, arched opening. The caves lead to a safe house. We'll be able to regroup there. They had no choice but to trust her. As they entered the cave, Elias's mind raced. This was the moment. They had come this far. But the road ahead was only going to get harder. And there was no guarantee they would survive the next battle. The narrow tunnel was a welcome sight, a place to catch their breath. But Elias knew they had no time to rest. The air in the cave was cool, damp, and heavy with the scent of stone and earth, a stark contrast to the choking atmosphere of the city. Seshka led the group deeper into the labyrinthine passage, her steps sure and quick, though her eyes betrayed the strain she was under. The others followed closely, their faces drawn, eyes darting anxiously as they moved through the dark. Shadowfeather was at the rear, keeping a watchful eye on the rear as they moved further from the sounds of the Varen pursuit. How long until we're safe? Elias whispered to Seshka, his voice carrying just enough to reach her without alerting anyone else. She didn't answer immediately, her pace steady but her mind clearly elsewhere. Finally, she spoke, her voice tight with concern. Safe isn't a word I can promise. The military will be sweeping these caves soon. It's only a matter of time before they trace us here. Elias felt a sharp pang of fear. There was no more running, no more hiding. We have to make it count, Elias said, gripping his weapon tighter. Whatever happens, we fight to the last. Seshka stopped abruptly, causing the others to halt as well. She turned to him, her eyes dark and resolute. That's what we've been doing all along, Elias. But you don't know what it's like to live in constant fear of annihilation. To know that every day could be your last. Elias took a step closer, his voice soft but firm. I know more than you think. I'm not just fighting for you, Seshka. I'm fighting for something bigger than both of us. This war, the way they've been treating your people, it has to stop. A long silence stretched between them. Then Seshka nodded. Then we'll make them listen. We have to. The quiet crackle of distant voices echoed through the cave walls, and Elias's heart raced. The Varen were getting closer. The stakes were higher than ever. They reached a small clearing within the cave system, a haven of sorts where Seshka had once met with other resistance fighters. A large table stood in the center, surrounded by chairs. Maps and data pads cluttered the surface, showing routes, messages, and coded information that Elias couldn't entirely decipher. This place had been the heart of their rebellion, the last bastion of their resistance. Shadowfeather moved swiftly to the table, pulling out a datapad and starting to assess the situation. His fingers flew over the screen, his eyes narrowing as he processed the latest information. "They're not far behind," he muttered. "We've got maybe an hour before they send in ground teams." Elias cursed under his breath. "How many can we fight off?" "Not enough," Shadowfeather said grimly. "But we can slow them down." Seshka stepped forward. "We'll have to make our stand here." Her gaze turned to Elias, meeting his with an unspoken understanding. "I trust you." Elias nodded sharply. The time for planning was over. It was time to act. "We make it count," he repeated, his voice heavy with resolve. The others began moving into position, fortifying the cave's entrances with makeshift barricades and weapons. Elias stayed close to Seshka, helping her prepare an escape route in case things went south. But deep down, he knew this was their last shot. If they didn't win this fight, they would be hunted down, just like the rest of the Sari who had fallen before them. And yet, despite the odds, Elias felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose. Maybe, just maybe, this battle could change the course of the war. Time crawled by as the echoes of distant footsteps grew louder. Elias stood at the cave's entrance, watching the narrow passageway as the tension thickened in the air. Every breath felt like it could be his last. Then they came. The first wave of Varan soldiers stormed through the cave entrance, their weapons raised, prepared for anything. But they hadn't expected the resistance. They hadn't expected Elias or Seshka, or the sheer determination of those who refused to be cowed any longer. Gunfire erupted. The crackling sound of energy blasts filled the air, followed by the sharp hiss of alien weaponry. Elias didn't hesitate, he fired. The first soldier fell, and Elias moved with practiced precision, clearing the path ahead. Seshka was beside him, her blaster in hand, her aim deadly accurate. "Keep moving," Elias shouted, pulling back to cover the others. Shadowfeather and the rest of the resistance were in the thick of the fight, their movements swift and efficient, like a well-oiled machine. The Varan soldiers pressed on, but the resistance was fighting with everything they had. For their freedom, for their people, for the chance to finally end this endless cycle of oppression. Minutes felt like hours as the battle raged on. The cave shook with each blast, the walls trembling under the force of the conflict. Elias ducked behind a makeshift barricade, his breath ragged, his heart hammering in his chest. "We need to fall back," Seshka yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. "They're sending in reinforcements." But before they could retreat, the entrance was blocked by more Varan forces. A brutal surge of enemies flooded in, and Elias knew they were trapped. There was no more running, no more escaping. "We fight," Elias shouted. "For the future of your people." The resistance rallied around him, their spirits igniting as they pushed back against the invaders. But Elias could see it in their eyes. They knew they were outnumbered. This was the endgame, the final stand. And yet, amidst the chaos, a flicker of hope remained. Seshka stood beside him, her determination unwavering. She fought not just for survival but for something more, something worth dying for. In that moment, Elias understood. This wasn't just about saving the Sari. It was about igniting a revolution, the spark that would set the galaxy ablaze. He raised his weapon, fired once more, and charged forward. Together, they would fight until the end. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stellar HFY content. Ring that bell to stay updated, and we'll see you next time.